The modern concept of equality isn't actually a tool for justice at all. What if it's a highly sophisticated linguistic virus?
A virus that is deliberately designed to extract your resources.
Yeah, exactly. What if the institutions you rely on, like your workplace, the legal system, even your church, are fundamentally built on a biological mechanism of parasitism?
It's a pretty wild premise.
It is. But today, we are unpacking a manual that claims to prove exactly that. So, welcome to the deep dives. And right off the top, do us a huge favor, like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these massive, uncompromising explorations of the most controversial texts out there.
Because today's deep dive is definitely that kind of exploration.
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at a highly provocative new ebook. I mean, it is an absolute lightning rod of a text. It's a manual designed specifically for men's rights activists and, red-pilled manosphere men.
Right. And if you find this exploration fascinating, if you want to see the primary source for yourself, check out the actual arguments, you should absolutely go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
Yeah, definitely check it out.
The book is titled Cuck Theology, Dismantling Woke Churches of Female Supremacy by Conrad Riker.
And the mission of today's deep dive is to rigorously map out Riker's core foundational argument.
Right, which is this idea that Western institutions, and we mean everything from family courts to the corporate boardroom, the educational system, all the way to the church altar, have been systematically captured.
Captured by feminists and cultural Marxists.
Exactly. And by executing this capture, Riker argues they have fundamentally and violently altered the historical role of men.
Now, before we start pulling this apart, we really have to make our position crystal clear here. The source material we're diving into today contains highly charged, incredibly controversial political and social commentary.
Very controversial. It is dense, it's provocative, and it is entirely uncompromising.
Right. So we want to state right now, for the record, we are not taking sides here.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing, we are not validating, nor are we condemning the viewpoints of the author. Our role today is strictly to act as your analytical guides.
Exactly. We're just going to unpack the ideas, the historical claims, and the very specific logical syllogisms contained in this text.
So that you, the listener, can understand the exact architecture of Riker's worldview.
Right. Our job is just to synthesize the mechanics of his argument. We want to look at the load-bearing walls of his philosophy, see how they connect, where the logic holds up, and what foundational assumptions he's making about human nature.
So to put it directly, if you are a man exploring the red pill space, trying to understand the history of our institutions before this alleged ideological capture took place, this deep dive is going to dissect the exact blueprint Riker lays out.
Let's get right into the foundation of it then.
Yeah, let's do it. Because Riker doesn't begin his book by complaining about modern dating apps or, pop culture trends. He starts with a linguistic war.
A war over words.
Right. He claims that the current system, which he calls the gynocentric matrix, maintains its power entirely through the manipulation of language. And he calls this mechanism the chthonic helix.
Yeah, the chthonic helix. And to understand what he means by that, we really have to look at the specific etymology he uses right out of the gate.
He goes right for the word cuck.
He does. He forces the reader to confront that word. Now, in modern internet parlance, that's often just thrown around as a derogatory insult, just a meme.
Oh, totally. It's everywhere online.
But Riker strips it of its internet irony. He takes it all the way back to its biological and etymological roots. The term actually derives from the old French word cuckoo, which refers directly to the cuckoo bird.
And the cuckoo birdie is famous in the animal kingdom for a very specific survival strategy, right? Rude parasitism.
Exactly. Riker spends a huge amount of time detailing the biology of brood parasitism to set up his whole sociological framework.
Walk us through how that works in nature.
So, the female cuckoo bird does not build her own nest. She doesn't expend the energy or the resources required to create a safe environment at all.
Right, she outsources it.
Yes. She locates the strong, fully functioning nest of another species, like, say, a warbler. She waits until the warbler is distracted, and then she covertly lays her egg in the warbler's nest.
That is so wild.
And it gets worse. When the cuckoo chick hatches, it's biologically engineered to be larger, louder, and significantly more demanding than the warbler's actual offspring.
But the warbler doesn't notice. It doesn't realize it's a different bird.
That's the critical mechanic here. The host bird is completely trapped by its own biological imperative. It hears a chick crying, and its instinct just screams, feed it.
Wow. So it's blinded by its own evolutionary mandate to nurture.
Exactly. So the warbler exhausts its own vital resources, flying back and forth relentlessly, completely depleting its energy to raise what is essentially a predator.
A predator inside its own home.
Right. And that predator, as it grows, eventually leverages its massive size to push the warbler's true offspring right out of the nest.
Just plunging them into the dirt.
Yeah, ensuring it commands 100% of the host's resources.
I mean, it is a brutal, vivid image of nature. But Riker doesn't leave it in the forest. He takes that biological reality of brood parasitism and maps it directly, one-to-one, onto modern human institutions.
Yes, this is the core of what he calls Cuck Theology.
He argues that modern Western men are the host bird.
In his framework, the rational, productive man is being psychologically and legally shamed into feeding a cultural rot that actively seeks to destroy him.
He is the host bird.
Right, he's blinded by his own masculine biological instinct to protect and provide. But instead of providing for his own lineage or his own family, he's being ordered to surrender his assets.
Ordered by who, exactly?
By the state, by the church, by human resources departments. They demand he subsidize a system that views his very masculinity as a toxic pathology. He is quite literally feeding the cuckoo chick.
Okay, but how does the cuckoo bird actually trick the host in human society? In nature, it's physical camouflage. But in human society, the mechanism they use to blind the host bird, according to Riker, is language.
Language is the camouflage.
Right. He talks extensively about classical education, specifically the Trivium, so grammar, logic, and rhetoric. But he focuses intensely on grammar. And, he doesn't mean grammar like dangling participles or where to put a comma.
He's talking about the power of definition.
Exactly.
In classical terms, grammar is the science of naming reality. It is the absolute foundation of thought. Because if you cannot define a thing accurately, you cannot apply logic to it.
And you definitely can't use rhetoric to debate it.
Right. So Riker argues that the cultural Marxists have executed what he calls a satanic inversion of grammar.
A satanic inversion, that is strong language.
Very strong. His premise is that when the progressive matrix cannot win on the objective merits of an argument, because their systems are inefficient or, logically contradictory, they don't argue better. They simply change the definitions of the words being used.
He uses the terms equality versus equity as his prime example of this linguistic weaponization, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
Let's break down exactly how he defines both, because the distinction between those two words is basically the load-bearing pillar of his economic argument.
Okay, so Riker defines equality as the historical meritocratic guarantee of equal opportunity under the law.
Like a level playing field.
Exactly. It's the operating system that built Western civilization, in his view. It's the idea that the starting line is the same, but the outcome depends entirely on objective competence, intelligence, and physical labor.
Right, so under equality, a hierarchy forms naturally based on merit.
Yes. But he argues this term has been violently, deliberately replaced in the institutional lexicon by equity.
And equity, in Riker's dictionary, is a mathematically terrifying concept.
Oh, absolutely. In his view, equity is the forced, mathematically engineered demand for equal outcomes.
Equal outcomes regardless of input.
Right. And here's where Riker connects the linguistic shift to literal resource extraction. To achieve equal outcomes between people of fundamentally unequal competence or drive, you have to execute a violent, state-sponsored extraction of resources.
You have to take from the capable to subsidize the incapable.
Exactly. He explicitly states in the book, equality builds skyscrapers, equity burns them down to ensure everyone is equally warm in the ashes.
Wow, that is quite a quote.
It is. So when a corporate HR department or a government institution demands equity, Riker claims they are not asking for fairness at all.
What are they asking for?
They are actually demanding the extraction of male surplus labor to fund female-centric or institutional dysfunction.
Okay, think about the actual mechanics of that for a second. If I'm a guy sitting in a corporate HR meeting and the mandate comes down that our department needs more equity in leadership, Riker is saying that the system is demanding I voluntarily suppress my own competence, my own drive for promotion, so that someone less capable can be artificially elevated using my foundational labor.
Yes, to support the department.
And if I object to that math, I am not debated. I am just labeled a threat.
Exactly. Which brings us to exactly how this linguistic war is fought on the ground. Riker points to a specific psychological tactic he claims is universally used in these spaces. He calls it Darvo.
Let's unpack the mechanics of Darvo, because this is crucial to his whole thesis.
So DARVO is an acronym that actually originated in interpersonal psychology. It was created to describe the predictable behavioral patterns of domestic abusers.
What does it stand for?
It stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender.
Right. So if you catch an abuser lying, they first deny they lied, then they attack you for being paranoid. And suddenly, they are the victim of your lack of trust.
Exactly. But Riker elevates DARVO from one-on-one relationships to a massive institutional weapon. He says it is a dark triad tactic deployed by what he calls the secular church of the woke university and by corporate HR.
Walk us through how he sees this playing out in an actual institutional setting.
Sure. Riker argues that when a rational man points out a logical flaw or an unfair policy or a blatant double standard in the workplace, the system doesn't debate him on the facts.
Because they can't.
Right. The system cannot afford to debate the facts because the facts do not support equity. Instead, the institution deploys DARVO.
So what's step one?
First, they deny the objective reality of his claim. Second, they attack his character. They usually label his logical assertion as toxic, hostile, or aggressive.
Oh, right. Using those buzzwords.
Exactly. And finally, miraculously, the institution, or the female accuser, reverses the roles entirely, crowning themselves the victim of his patriarchal oppression.
And he gives a very specific, high-profile historical example of this epistemic collapse, doesn't he? He points to the 2022 Supreme Court confirmation hearings of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
He does. And he treats it as a defining civilizational moment.
Let's look at how he frames this, because it's fascinating.
During those confirmation hearings, Justice Jackson was asked a seemingly simple grammatical question. She was asked to provide the definition of the word woman.
Right, I remember this.
And she responded that she could not provide a definition because she is not a biologist. Riker uses this exchange as the ultimate exemplar of what he calls the epistemic double-bind.
An epistemic double-bind. Okay, we need to be very clear about what that term means for the listener.
Let's define it.
Epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? It's how we know what is true. So an epistemic double-bind is a situation where the system forces you into a contradiction about the very nature of reality itself.
Exactly.
What are the actual mechanics of this bind in practice?
The mechanic is enforced cognitive dissonance. It means that observable biological reality is being officially denied at the highest levels of law and culture in order to enforce compliance.
So denying what's right in front of your eyes.
Right. Riker argues that a sitting federal judge reducing a fundamental biological binary, a reality recognized by every human civilization since the dawn of time, to a highly specialized academic discipline is evidence of a schizophrenic epistemology.
That's a heavy claim.
It is. The Matrix demands that you pretend subjective identity overrides objective biology. But simultaneously, if you refuse to play along, the Matrix will punish you with the full force of objective material consequences.
Like losing your job?
Exactly. You are forced to actively deny reality to keep your job, your social standing, or your freedom.
I want to introduce an analogy here, because as I was reading Riker's description of this linguistic manipulation, it feels exactly like analyzing a computer virus.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, think of a human society as a massive operating system. Language is the core code. It's the binary, the ones and zeros that tell the computer what is a functional file, what is a necessary program, and what is a malicious threat.
Right.
If a hacker wants to take over a massive, secure system, they don't just brute force delete files. They rewrite the dictionary of the core code itself.
They change the definitions.
Exactly. They tell the antivirus software that the malware is actually an essential system process and that the antivirus itself is the real threat. That is exactly what Riker is saying happened to our language.
That is spot on.
The cultural virus rewrote the code so that objective truth is flagged as toxic malware, and parasitic extraction is flagged as essential empathy.
That is a highly accurate reflection of his premise. In fact, he explicitly refers to this as an ontological deathmatch.
Ontology being the study of being, of existence.
Right. The parasite does not just take resources, it rewrites the nervous system of the host, so that the host actually defends the parasite.
But this raises a massive question for me, and it's something I kept bumping up against while reviewing his framework.
What's that?
If this linguistic capture is truly as complete as Riker claims, if the entire corporate, legal, and educational structure is using a completely different, corrupted dictionary, how does he suggest an individual man actually reclaim logos or objective truth?
That's a tough situation.
Yeah, I mean, how do you fight a battle when you aren't even allowed to define the terms of the battlefield. If you walk into HR and speak classical grammar,
Yeah.
they literally won't understand you, or worse, they'll fire you for it.
Well, Riker's answer to that is rigorous, uncompromising refusal. He says, you must master the trivium yourself. You must lock down definitions in your own home and in your own mind.
So it starts internally.
Yes. His tactical advice is that when an institutional enforcer uses a weaponized term like toxic masculinity or microaggression, you do not engage in a debate about the nuance of the term.
Because that's playing their game.
Exactly. You completely reject the term itself as a logical contradiction. You refuse to let the opposition dictate the grammar of the conversation. You force them to use objective language, or you just refuse to communicate at all.
So it's really about holding a linguistic line in the sand. But this battle over definitions isn't just an abstract academic theory for Riker.
Not at all.
No. He argues that this linguistic virus has fundamentally rewritten the most important foundational contract of human civilization.
The institution of marriage.
Exactly. Because if they can redefine what a woman is, they can completely redefine what a husband owes. Which brings us to his analysis of the fall of the patriarch, and he provocatively calls the marriage plantation.
To fully understand Riker's incredibly severe critique of modern marriage, we have to examine the historical baseline he establishes. He takes us all the way back to the Roman Republic.
Okay, let's go there.
Specifically, he looks at the concept of the paterfamilias as it was codified in the 12 tables around 450 BC.
Now, this is fascinating because standard modern sociological critiques usually frame the Roman patriarch as the ultimate tyrant, right?
Oh, absolutely.
He's painted as this man with absolute unchecked power over his household, who subjugated his wife and children simply because the law allowed him to be a dictator.
And Riker violently rejects that framing. He argues that modern sociologists commit what he calls the presentism fallacy.
Which means judging the past by today's standards.
Right. Judging the incredibly harsh, violent survival mechanisms of the ancient world through the lens of modern, air-conditioned, decadent comfort. He argues that the paterfamilias wasn't about tyranny, it was about ultimate, crushing accountability.
Accountability.
Not just power.
Exactly. Yes, the patriarch possessed manus, which was the lawful command over his home and everyone in it. But with that command came total, inescapable legal liability.
Right. Break down what that liability actually looked like in 450 BC for us. Well, in ancient Rome, there was no corporate shield. There was no state welfare to catch you if you fell. If the patriarch's son broke the law, the father paid the penalty, often physically or financially.
He literally took the hit.
He did. If the household went into debt due to a bad harvest or poor planning, the father's body could literally be forfeit to his creditors through debt slavery.
That is intense.
It was a brutal world. Riker writes that the patriarch stood as a physical and legal buffer between a brutal, unforgiving reality and his dependents. He took the strikes of the world so his family could live securely within the walls he maintained.
So the authority was inextricably linked to the burden. You couldn't have one without the other.
Exactly. Riker argues that modern feminists look at the command structure of the ancient family and just call it cruelty, completely ignoring the immense burden. They ignore the constant threat of state violence or starvation that pressed down exclusively on the shoulders of the man carrying that authority.
The power was simply the necessary tool to manage the liability.
Right.
So, in Riker's historical timeline, when did this functional, survival-based patriarchy, where authority matched responsibility, when did it start to collapse? He points to a very specific cultural and historical pivot, doesn't he?
He does. He points directly to the Victorian era.
The Victorian era.
Yes. Riker views the Victorian era as the original patient zero for the cultural infection we face today.
Interesting. Why the Victorians?
He cites Coventry Patmore's famous 1854 poem, The Angel in the House. This poem and the broader cultural movement it represented idealized women as pure, domestic deities who were inherently morally superior to the rough, competitive, blood-stained world of men.
And Riker says this romantic elevation of women was actually a strategic disaster, right? It wasn't an elevation, it was a surrender.
Precisely. Riker argues that Victorian men, out of a misplaced sentimental empathy and the growing comforts of the Industrial Revolution, voluntarily surrendered their spiritual and temporal authority.
They just handed it over.
They did. They placed women on a moral pedestal, and by doing so, handed over the strategic high ground of the culture. The biological, chivalrous impulse to protect was hijacked and twisted into a societal mandate to obey female emotionalism.
And this cultural shift quickly became codified into hard law, didn't it?
It absolutely did.
This brings us to a specific piece of legislation he highlights: the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 in the United Kingdom. Explain how this act shifted the mechanics of marriage.
Okay, so before the 1857 Act, Riker notes, marriage was a rigidly binding contract of mutual complementary duty. It was incredibly difficult and rare to dissolve, primarily because the survival of the societal unit and the rearing of children depended on its stability.
It was permanent.
Very much so. But the 1857 Act shifted jurisdiction from the ecclesiastical courts to the civil courts, beginning the process of making divorce much more accessible.
And crucially, it began laying the legal groundwork for the state to manage the financial fallout of a dissolved marriage.
Yes. Riker argues this was the exact moment marriage began transforming from a vital survival structure into a state-subsidized mechanism for female resource extraction.
And he backs up this claim of resource extraction with some incredibly stark and highly controversial economic arguments.
He really goes into the numbers.
He does. He looks at modern demographic data and makes the claim that women, as an aggregate demographic block, are net negative lifetime taxpayers.
Yes.
Let's pause here because this is a massive claim. We need to look closely at his methodology. How is he doing this math? Is he completely ignoring unpaid domestic labor? Is this strictly a metric of federal income tax?
That's a vital question.
Because if he's only looking at tax brackets, that feels like a highly selective economic lens.
That is exactly the pushback that is necessary here. Riker's metric is purely and ruthlessly fiscal. He is not looking at holistic societal value or unpaid domestic labor at all.
He's just looking at state ledgers.
Strictly state ledgers. He asserts that when you aggregate macroeconomic studies on welfare state utilization, public sector employment, which he views as a form of subsidized make-work single motherhood subsidies and lifetime healthcare consumption, women extract significantly more in state subsidies over their lifetimes than they contribute in net tax revenue.
So he's saying if you tally up every dollar a woman pays in taxes and subtract every dollar she utilizes in state services, schools, and healthcare, the number is negative.
That is his empirical claim, yes. Therefore, he formulates a rigid economic syllogism.
Which is?
If the modern welfare state consistently distributes more resources to the female demographic than they put into the system, that system is fundamentally mathematically dependent on the forced extraction of surplus wealth from male productivity.
Meaning men, in the aggregate, must be net positive taxpayers to fund the deficit created by the female demographic.
Exactly.
Which leads directly into his view on modern family courts.
Yeah.
Because if the state relies on extracting male wealth, the family court is the engine of that extraction.
It is the mechanism.
He doesn't just call the family courts unfair. He calls the entire system a satanic inversion of law. Break down the mechanics of why he uses such apocalyptic language for a divorce proceeding.
Because, in his view, the modern family court system doesn't just divide current assets, it legally seizes a man's future labor.
Future labor, not just what he has now.
Exactly. Under historical law, a contract breach penalized the party that broke the contract. But Riker paints a picture of the modern no-fault system where a man can work his entire life to build wealth and stability.
Right.
His wife can initiate a no-fault divorce for emotional abandonment, which Riker points out as an entirely unfalsifiable subjective claim.
You can't prove it or disprove it.
Right. And the court, acting as her enforcer, will strip the man of his home, severely restrict access to his children, take half his retirement, and then attach a lien to his future earnings via alimony and child support.
He literally writes that the modern marriage contract grants a man the exact same legal autonomy as a conscripted laborer in a penal battalion.
It's a bleak comparison.
You cannot quit, you cannot leave, and your wages are garnished before you even see them.
And if we look at the mechanics of this, what Riker is really arguing is that the state has literally, functionally replaced the husband.
Walk us through the mechanics of that dynamic. How does the state act as a surrogate husband?
Let's look at evolutionary psychology for a moment. Historically, a woman's hypergamy, which is her biological instinct to seek a higher status, more capable mate, was constrained by harsh reality.
Right, there were physical consequences.
Exactly. If she abandoned a dutiful, providing husband on a whim, she faced the very real risk of starvation, exposure, or social ruin. But the modern welfare state and the family court system remove that physical risk entirely.
The state becomes the safety net.
More than a safety net.
Right.
The state promises the woman that if she leaves her husband, the state will step in and use its absolute monopoly on violence, meaning the police, the courts, and wage garnishment to force the husband to continue providing for her anyway, while she is free to seek a new mate. The state effectively acts as a surrogate husband, guaranteeing her resource security while unleashing her hypergamous impulses without consequence.
So the state enforces this surrender economically, using the threat of jail time and wage garnishment. But Riker claims that the spiritual and psychological justification for this surrender, the reason men walk willingly into this dynamic, comes from somewhere else entirely.
Yes, it comes from the modern captured church.
Which leads us to the very title of his book, Cuck Theology, the Woke Church, and the HR Sacrament.
This is where Riker's critique moves from legal structures to spiritual architecture. Riker argues that the modern Christian church has completely abandoned its historical architecture and purpose.
He uses very specific spatial metaphors to describe this shift, doesn't he?
He does. Historically, he notes, the church was built on what he calls a vertical hierarchy of logos.
Define that for us. What does a vertical hierarchy of logos look like in practice?
It means a focus on objective, transcendent truth. It involves a profound, almost terrifying awe of God the Father. It is characterized by martial rigor, discipline, and a clear, unapologetic structure of authority.
So it's very structured.
Yes, you look up toward the divine, and that vertical orientation demands you elevate your behavior to meet a standard of excellence and righteousness.
But he says that vertical orientation has been dismantled and replaced by a horizontal grievance matrix.
Exactly. The vertical axis has been flattened into the horizontal. Instead of looking up in fearful reverence and striving for objective moral truth, the modern church looks inward.
What are they looking at?
It obsesses over comfort, emotional validation, therapeutic healing, and communal grievance. He argues this entire shift was engineered to cater exclusively to female emotionalism.
And he points to literal, observable, architectural, and liturgical shifts to prove this. He talks about the music, for instance.
The music is a huge point for him.
Historically, the church sang robust, martial hymns. Songs like A Mighty Fortress is Our God. Songs that felt like you were marching into spiritual battle alongside a brotherhood.
Yes, the lyrics were about sin, redemption, and divine sovereignty.
And what do we have now?
Breathy, effeminate acoustic ballads, looping minor chords that Riker says are deliberately designed to induce a hypnotic, emotional trance state rather than inspire rational theological thought.
He mockingly refers to this as the Jesus is my boyfriend phenomenon, right?
He does. He argues that modern worship music subtly sexualizes the worshiper's relationship with Christ, emphasizing romantic longing, holding hands, and emotional intimacy instead of awe, obedience, and martial duty.
It's a complete softening of the divine image. He also provides concrete case studies of what happens mathematically and demographically when a denomination fully embraces this horizontal matrix.
Yes, he cites the 2003 Episcopal Church Schism.
Remind us what happened there.
So, the 2003 schism was triggered by the ordination of an openly gay bishop. For Riker, this isn't just a theological dispute. It is the ultimate proof of an institution prioritizing fluid, culturally Marxist equity over vertical, objective moral law.
The church chose horizontal inclusion over vertical obedience.
Exactly.
And what was the demographic result of that?
Institutional collapse. He looks at the massive membership losses in the Presbyterian Church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church between the years 2000 and 2020.
It's a mass exodus.
Right. Riker's empirical claim here is that when a denomination ordains women, softens its theology, and shifts to an emotive, sentiment-driven liturgy, it rapidly devolves into nothing more than a social welfare club.
And it loses the men.
It hemorrhages male attendance. Because men, at a fundamental biological level, are repelled by an institution that pathologizes their natural stoicism and demands they emote like women.
Which brings us to the man standing at the pulpit. Riker says the modern pastor does not function as a shepherd anymore.
No, he functions as a corporate HR officer.
Enforcing what Riker calls the HR sacrament. Let's dig into that.
The HR sacrament is the absolute demand for compliance and emotional vulnerability. Riker creates a devastating psychological profile of the modern woke pastor.
How does he profile him?
He categorizes this pastor as the ultimate beta provider, a man who weaponizes therapeutic language to appease the female majority sitting in the pews. And this pastor deploys a psychological double bind on the men in his congregation.
Creating the archetype of the nice guy Christian.
Exactly.
Okay, let's stop and look closely at this double bind, because it presents a massive paradox. Riker claims the church explicitly demands that men be vulnerable. The pastor says, open up, share your feelings, cry with us. Be a gentle servant leader.
Right, that's the explicit message.
But then Riker explicitly warns that any man who actually complies with this demand, any man who cries in small group, is immediately discarded with disgust by the women in the room.
Yes, he is.
So here's my pushback on Riker's logic. If this is true, how does Riker explain the psychology of the pastors who actively enforce this trap on their own congregations? Do they know they're destroying the men they are supposed to lead? Is it malice? Or is it ignorance?
That is a critical question about intent versus conditioning. According to Riker's framework, it isn't conscious malice. The pastor is fundamentally a captive of what Riker terms the animus projective helix.
Okay, what exactly is the animus projective helix?
In Jungian psychology, the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman. Riker uses the term to describe a dynamic where the pastor completely sublimates his own masculinity to project whatever version of the masculine the female collective demands.
He becomes a mirror for them.
Yes, the pastor enforces the trap because his own institutional survival, his paycheck, and his social standing depend entirely on keeping the female majority happy, because they do the majority of the tithing and volunteering.
So the pastor demands male vulnerability because women state that they want vulnerable men.
Exactly, but there is a difference between stated preference and revealed preference.
Right, what they say versus what they actually respond to.
Exactly. Riker argues that while women cognitively say they want a soft, vulnerable man, their biology is violently repelled by male weakness.
So the pastor is basically forcing the men into a trap.
Yes, the pastor, acting as the HR officer, forces the men in his congregation to castrate their own masculinity to appease the stated desires of the women. But then the pastors must watch those same women lose all romantic, sexual, and spiritual respect for the men who actually obey the command.
The pastor is simply a middleman in a systemic biological grift.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
Riker has a line in the book that I think is just haunting. He says, he demands your tears, but his system despises your blood.
That perfectly encapsulates the paradox of the modern church.
But Riker argues that this pathologization of male nature, this forced feminization, doesn't start when you get married or when you join a church. It starts much, much earlier.
It starts on the playground.
Yes. The conditioning begins on the playground. And this brings us to his analysis of educational castration and biological reality.
Riper asserts that Western institutions systematically emasculate boys from an incredibly young age, deliberately replacing necessary male resilience with an ideology he calls safetyism.
He uses some wild yet entirely real specific examples from the text to illustrate this. Like, he talks about the nationwide trend of eliminating competitive playground games.
Games like dodgeball, tag, and Red Rover have been banned in school districts across the country.
Why does Riker care so much about dodgeball? I mean, it's just a game, right?
Well, because under the guise of inclusivity and safety, the feminized educational system is actually executing a calculated dismantling of male hierarchies of merit.
How does dodgeball build a hierarchy?
Riker explains the mechanics of boyhood. Boys naturally organize themselves based on physical competence, courage, and competitive excellence. It is a strictly vertical hierarchy.
The strong rise.
Yes. The strong and capable rise. The weak are forced to adapt or improve. But the modern school administrator, whom Riker characterizes as a hyperneurotic, ideologically possessed maternal figure, views this natural physical male competition as a direct threat.
A threat to what?
A threat to matriarchal peace and horizontal equity.
So by banning dodgeball, she isn't really protecting kids. She's destroying the hierarchy.
Exactly. By banning dodgeball, she flattens the hierarchy. She ensures that no exceptional boy can rise above another through physical dominance, effectively dragging the exceptional down to the level of the mediocre to ensure universal emotional comfort.
And it goes far beyond just banning physical games. It morphs into actual documented disciplinary action against male imagination.
It does.
He cites a real case from 2001 where an 8-year-old boy in Arkansas was suspended for pointing a breaded chicken finger at a classmate and saying, "Bang, bang."
Riker uses that absurdity to define the core, terrifying directive of the modern educational system, replacing hardness with softness.
Treating normal play as a crime.
Right. To the woke administrator, a boy playing cops and robbers isn't engaging in normal imaginative play. He is committing a microaggression. His very testosterone is treated as a dangerous contagion, an existential threat that must be stamped out with behavioral referrals, suspension, or increasingly heavy psychiatric medication.
So the modern classroom is just a sterile, padded cell where the highest virtue a boy can display is a terrified, compliant stillness.
Exactly.
And the deeply tragic part of Riker's analysis is that these boys inevitably grow up. They survive the padded cell of the playground, they enter the adult dating market, and they run headfirst into a massive psychological trap.
Yes, this is where he introduces the Batesonian double bind.
Right, let's really explain what that is. Gregory Bateson was an anthropologist and systems theorist who studied schizophrenia.
He was.
And he theorized that schizophrenia could be induced by a double-bind communication paradox where an individual receives conflicting messages, and no matter how they respond, they are punished. How does Riker apply Bateson's theory of schizophrenia to modern dating?
It's a brilliant, if bleak, application. The Batesonian double bind involves a primary injunction and a secondary injunction that contradict each other, and a tertiary injunction that prevents the victim from escaping the field.
So what's the primary injunction in dating?
In modern dating, society explicitly demands a safe man. This is the primary injunction. A safe man is compliant, highly emotive, fiercely egalitarian, and entirely non-threatening.
That's the cultural message we all hear.
Yeah.
Be in touch with your feelings. Be my peer. Never raise your voice.
Exactly. But level 2, the implicit secondary injunction driven by millions of years of biology, demands a protector.
A completely different type of man.
Right. Riker argues that women do not actually want to feel safe from danger by living in a padded room. They want to feel protected from danger by a highly dangerous, capable man who has chosen to ally with them.
So a dangerous man under control.
Yes. As he puts it, a sheep is safe, but the woman desires the wolf that guards the flock. So the modern man is ordered by the culture to become the safe man.
But when he does,
The moment he complies, her hypergamous biological instinct registers him as genetic garbage, and she loses all attraction to him.
he literally cannot win. If he acts like a wolf, the culture cancels him. If he acts like a sheep, the woman rejects him.
It's a complete psychological trap.
And this leads to what I think is the most provocative piece of logic in the entire book.
Yeah.
His Aristotelian syllogism about female arousal and feminist politics. Walk us through this logic step by step.
Let's construct the logic exactly as Riker lays it out, mapping the mechanics of his argument.
Okay, what's the major premise?
Major premise. Human female arousal requires the total suspension of egalitarian peer dynamics. It fundamentally requires polarity,
Yeah.
the presence of dominance, and the surrender of submission.
Okay, and the minor premise.
Minor premise. Modern feminism absolutely mandates egalitarian peer dynamics in all male-female interactions, explicitly pathologizing dominance.
Therefore.
Conclusion. Feminist sexual politics actively and inevitably destroy the biological capacity for female arousal.
That is a staggering conclusion. If feminism achieves its stated goal, romance literally dies.
And this logical conclusion, Riker argues, explains the cultural phenomenon of the bad boy escape valve.
Oh, the bad boy. How does he fit in?
Because feminism forces women to consciously suppress their own biological nature and demand egalitarianism, they end up in a schizophrenic state.
Demanding two opposite things.
Yes. They demand a compliant beta provider to pay the bills, listen to their feelings, and satisfy the feminist cultural mandate. But simultaneously, they secretly crave the unyielding, unapologetic bad boy who completely ignores feminist rules.
Because only he can fulfill their biological need for polarity.
Exactly.
It is the dual mating strategy completely unmasked. But what happens when these deeply ingrained biological realities are forced out of the dating market and into the corporate workplace?
That's where things get really messy.
Because Riker has a very specific mechanical take on how female psychology manifests in HR departments.
He links this directly to the evolutionary differences in male versus female conflict resolution. Historically, men resolve conflict through direct confrontation. It might be physical, it might be blunt verbal debate, but it is direct, and crucially, it is usually resolved quickly.
Once the fight is over, it's over.
Right. Once the hierarchy is established or the dispute settled, men can return to the phalanx, the cooperative working group. Women, evolutionarily lacking the physical strength for direct confrontation, resolve conflict through relational aggression.
The whisper network. Gossip, reputational destruction, social ostracization.
Exactly. It is covert and it is perpetual. And Riker argues that the modern corporate workplace has completely outlawed the male method of direct conflict resolution while enshrining female relational aggression as corporate law.
So the HR department is the institutionalization of gossip.
Yes. A man can have his career, his reputation, and his livelihood utterly destroyed not by objective, measurable evidence of poor performance, but by an anonymous complaint about his vibe. a perceived slight, or an unintentional microaggression.
It's terrifying when you frame it like that.
It is the dark triad, traits manipulation, deceit, and shifting the burden of proof codified into company policy.
So if we step back and look at the blueprint Riker has drawn for us, we are looking at a society where the language is inverted to extract your resources. Marriage is a state-enforced financial trap. The church castrates your spirit, the schools pathologize your boyhood, dating is a biological paradox, and the workplace is a psychological minefield.
That's the diagnosis.
Having diagnosed this total capture of the legal, spiritual, educational, and corporate spheres, we have to look at his solution. Because this isn't just a 300-page book of complaints, it's a tactical manual for survival.
It's highly actionable.
How does a man actually operate in this matrix? Let's analyze his tactical framework, going Galt and the phalanx.
Okay, so Riker advocates for a strategy of ruthless strategic withdrawal. He uses the concept of going Galt,
Which is a direct reference to Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, where the most productive, capable members of society realize the system is parasitic and they simply withdraw their labor and intellect.
Right, letting the corrupt system collapse under its own weight.
He tells men to stop trying to reform the gynocentric matrix. You cannot vote your way out of it, and you cannot argue with HR. You have to start strategizing for the exit.
And he gets incredibly specific about how to do this legally and geographically.
Explain the mechanics of what he calls jurisdictional arbitrage.
Jurisdictional arbitrage is the practice of taking advantage of the differences in laws between distinct political entities. Riker explicitly advises men to relocate their physical presence, their businesses, and their assets to jurisdictions that are fundamentally hostile to the state's ability to act as a surrogate husband.
He points to states like Florida and Texas, right?
Yes, specifically those states.
Why those states specifically? What is the legal mechanic that protects men there?
First, they lack a state income tax, which immediately deprives the broader welfare state of a significant portion of a man's surplus labor.
Just cutting off the funding.
Yeah, right. But more importantly, in the context of family law, these states have much stricter limitations on permanent alimony enforcement compared to progressive states like California or New York.
How big is the difference?
Huge. In California, a long-term marriage can result in lifetime alimony, effectively chaining a man's future labor to his ex-wife forever. By moving to Florida, a man legally severs the most extreme mechanisms the state uses to enforce resource extraction.
He's telling men to legally starve the beast, deprive the parasite of the host by changing the legal battlefield. But what about assets that he already has?
For assets that remain domestic, he heavily advocates for utilizing domestic asset protection trusts, or DAPTs.
DTTs, where do you set those up?
He specifically names states like Nevada and Delaware. The mechanics of a DAPT allow an individual to transfer their assets into a trust that shields them from future creditors.
And in Riker's framework, future creditors primarily mean vindictive ex-spouses backed by the family court system.
Exactly. He tells men to treat a marriage license not as a romantic vow, but with the exact cold, calculating paranoia of auditing a failing, fraudulent enterprise. You protect the capital first.
But let's ground this in reality for a second. What about the men who still have to clock in on Monday? The men who can't just move to Nevada tomorrow, set up a DAPT, and live off unbanked crypto.
Riker addresses them too.
Riker provides a psychological shield for the corporate environment, a way to survive the HR matrix day to day. He calls it the gray rock method. What are the mechanics of being a gray rock?
The gray rock method is actually a well-established psychological technique used by victims to deal with narcissists and psychopaths. Riker applies it directly to the HR commissars and the corporate diversity officers.
How do you do it?
The goal is to become completely emotionally uninteresting. You offer no personal details about your weekend. You display absolutely no emotional reactions to their ideological provocations.
Just total blank face.
Yes. You give short, non-committal, monosyllabic answers. You do not argue. You become as boring, impenetrable, and lifeless as a gray rock.
And you back that psychological shield up with what he calls the deadly force of objective timestamps.
Exactly. Because the progressive matrix relies on Darvo denying reality and reversing the victim, a man's only defense in a corporate setting is an undeniable objective paper trail.
Document everything.
Riker commands men to document every single interaction, every double standard, and every policy mandate via personal, off-site email backups.
So when HR deploys relational aggression, you don't respond with emotion.
No, you burn their cognitive load to the ground with administrative friction. You force them to fight on the terrain of objective facts and time-stamped evidence, which is an environment they fundamentally despise and are ill-equipped to handle.
This all leads to his ultimate spatial and philosophical metaphor. We've talked about the architecture of these systems. Riker contrasts the matrix and the resistance through two shapes, the circle and the phalanx.
This contrast is a brilliant distillation of his entire thesis.
Walk us through the shapes.
Riker points out that the favored spatial arrangement of the feminine matrix, whether it is a corporate HR seminar, a modern kindergarten classroom, or the woke church, is the circle.
Think of a therapy support group.
Exactly. Everyone sits in a circle facing inward. They are vulnerable, they are focused entirely on emotional exchange, subjective feelings, and validating each other's trauma.
And crucially, because everyone is looking inward, the borders of the circle are completely unguarded.
Nobody is watching the walls, whereas the phalanx...
The phalanx is the ancient Greek and Roman military formation.
Yeah.
It is a heavy, moving wall of male force.
Right. It relies entirely on the interlocking strength, absolute discipline, and objective competence of its constituent parts.
If one man drops his shield, the man next to him dies.
Exactly. And crucially, the phalanx faces outward toward the external threat. Riker argues that a thriving civilization fundamentally requires the phalanx men standing shoulder to shoulder, projecting force outward to keep the wolves at bay.
But the gynocentric society demands that men drop their shields.
Yes, it demands they sit in circles and expose their vulnerabilities, all while the borders of their civilization are overrun.
Okay, here is my major pushback on Riker's tactical framework. And this is where I think the logic gets incredibly tense.
What's the pushback?
He advocates for starving the beast by withdrawing surplus labor. He says, move to zero-tax states, use the gray rock method, be invisible. But he also explicitly commands men to build alternative institutions.
Like private shooting clubs and unbanked crypto syndicates.
Right, homeschooling co-ops. So let's look at the mechanics of this. Can a parallel society truly be built just on withdrawal? Or does building a new phalanx eventually, inevitably, require a direct physical or political confrontation with the matrix he describes?
It's a fair question.
I mean, if you build a fortress in Florida, doesn't the federal state eventually come to inspect the walls?
That is the ultimate tension, the unspoken friction in Riker's manual. He frames withdrawal not as cowardice, but as tactical repositioning. You withdraw to consolidate strength and preserve capital.
But it's not the end game.
No. If we analyze his ultimate vision, it is not isolationist. He envisions the rise of a neo-patriarchy.
A neo-patriarchy?
Yes. His underlying economic premise is that the current system is mathematically and structurally doomed to collapse under the weight of its own parasitic extraction and demographic suicide.
So it's just waiting for the crash.
His strategy is to ensure that when the existing matrix inevitably collapses, the men who have mastered the Trivium, secured their assets in DAPTs, and formed interlocking brotherhoods, the new phalanxes, are positioned to step into the vacuum and take command.
So, synthesizing everything we've discussed, Riker isn't trying to save the current iteration of Western society. He thinks it's already dead. He's building the lifeboat.
Yes, he wants to restore the patriarchy not as some nostalgic 1950s museum piece where everyone pretends to be happy, but as the only social technology historically proven capable of sustaining human flourishing against the harsh realities of nature.
And that restoration, in his view, must be driven by the absolute, uncompromising assertion of male rationality, objective truth, and vertical hierarchy.
He believes that nature, ultimately, respects only strength, logistics, and walls. And the men must be ready, trained, and unburdened when the time comes to build the new walls.
Which brings us to a final philosophical thought experiment that builds directly on the mechanics of Riker's text. Riker argues that civilization is a machine for keeping the wolf outside the wall, and that competent men are the load-bearing foundation of that machine.
That's the premise.
If that premise is true, what happens to the global infrastructure, the power grids, the supply chains, the water treatment plants, the massive physical structures of our society? If an entire generation of competent men successfully execute this phalanx strategy,
It's a terrifying question.
what happens if millions of men look at the systemic parasiton, realize they are the host bird, and completely withdraw their surplus participation, their tax dollars, and their protective instincts from the mainstream social contract?
It's a chilling socioeconomic thought experiment about the absolute fragility of our modern comforts.
If the engineers, the builders, and the protectors go on strike, how long does the skyscraper actually stand?
That is the exact unsettling question Riker wants his readers to internalize. The parasite cannot survive without the host. But if the host unplugs, the entire ecosystem fundamentally changes overnight.
If the ideas we discussed today intrigued you, provoked you, or challenged your understanding of our cultural architecture, remember that they come from a highly provocative primary source.
It's a text you really need to read to fully grasp.
You should immediately check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook Cuck Theology for yourself and examine the arguments firsthand.
And to continue exploring the author's tactical framework, his ongoing analysis of modern institutions, and to engage with his community, be sure to subscribe to @ConradRiker on Substack.
And finally, don't forget to like and subscribe to this deep dive so we can keep bringing you the most exhaustive, incisive analysis of the most controversial texts out there. Keep questioning the foundation, and we'll see you next time.